Kale wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of the small exploration shuttle. The wind on Arden was harsh and dry, a constant reminder that this planet had been abandoned by anyone who had once tried to settle here. The landscape stretched endlessly in shades of brown and gray, jagged rocks cutting across sand dunes that glimmered under the twin suns. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. Kale adjusted the straps of his backpack and checked his scanner again. Nothing yet, he muttered to himself, the screen showing only faint traces of minerals. Most explorers would have turned back by now. But Kale had a reason to keep going. His colony on Proxima 9 was struggling, and he had promised his younger sister, Mira, that he would bring back something valuable. Minerals, rare crystals, anything that could help feed the colony and keep them safe. He had always been small for his age, often overlooked by other explorers. But Kale had a fire inside him. It was not the fire of arrogance like some of the bigger, stronger explorers he had met. It was quiet, patient, a fire that refused to give up, and today he had a feeling it might guide him to something extraordinary. He moved carefully, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, powdery sand. The wind whistled past him, carrying strange metallic scents from deep within the rocks. As he approached a cluster of jagged formations, something unusual caught his eye, a faint glow coming from a shallow crater partially hidden behind a ridge. Kale's heart beat faster. This was not normal. Minerals didn't glow like this, at least not naturally. He crouched and brushed away the sand, revealing a circular pedestal carved into the stone. Resting atop it was a sword, unlike anything he had ever seen. Its blade shimmered with colors that seemed to shift depending on the angle of the light, and delicate markings ran along its length. The hilt was adorned with strange gemstones that pulsed softly, almost as if the sword were alive. Kale reached out slowly, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. His fingers brushed the hilt. Instantly, a surge of energy shot through his arm, knocking him back. He landed hard on the sand, his backpack tumbling beside him. A voice rumbled from the sword itself, deep, resonant, powerful. "Not you." Kyle froze, staring at the weapon. He blinked. What? "Not you," the voice repeated, growling like a wild animal, shaking the pedestal as if testing him. The glow along the blade flared. "You are not worthy." Kyle scrambled back to his feet. He had read about sentient weapons in legends, but he had never believed them. And yet here it was. The sword was alive in some strange, ancient way. It was judging him. I just want to help my colony," Kale said nervously, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone." The sword's glow dimmed slightly, but its voice remained stern. "Intentions alone do not make you worthy. Courage alone is not enough. You must prove your heart, your mind, and your spirit." Kyle took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He looked around, hoping no one had seen this. The planet was empty, silent, and he was alone. Still, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had found something incredible, something no one else had ever touched, but it rejected him. He sat on a nearby rock, thinking. He had trained as an explorer, learned survival, navigation, and even combat, but he had never faced anything like this. Not a wild animal, not a storm, something that could judge his very soul. For hours, Kyle studied the sword. He touched it carefully, trying to understand it. Each time he tried to lift it, it pulsed violently, the voice growling at him, shaking the pedestal. Yet something about it intrigued him. The sword had waited 1,000 years, as the legends said, for a true warrior. And maybe, Kale thought, just maybe it had waited for him, but he knew he was not ready yet. He was too inexperienced, too untested, and the sword knew it. Night fell on Arden, and the twin suns disappeared below the horizon. The desert turned cold, and strange lights shimmered in the sky. Kale huddled in his small portable shelter, the sword still glowing faintly in the crater below. He thought about his sister, about his colony, about the life he wanted to build. Maybe this sword was more than a weapon. Maybe it was a test, a chance for him to rise above who he was. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, the sword's glow dimmed to a soft heartbeat, as if it were alive and watching him. In his dreams, Kale saw flashes of warriors from the past, men and women who had tried to wield the sword and failed. They were not evil, not cruel. They simply did not have what it required. Each one fell because they lacked wisdom, compassion, or courage in the right measure. Kale felt their failures as if they were his own. He woke at dawn with a start. The cold wind bit at his skin, but he felt different, more determined. If he wanted to hold the sword, he would have to earn it. He packed his gear and made his way back to the crater. The sword pulsed brighter than ever when he arrived. "You return," it said. Its tone was curious now, less harsh but still cautious. "Why, I want to learn," Kyle admitted. "I want to prove I can be worthy. Not for glory, not for power, but for my people, for my sister, for what is right." The sword's glow flickered as if considering his words. Then it pulsed sharply and the pedestal rumbled. Kale braced himself. He grasped the hilt just barely and felt the energy flow through him. It was overwhelming, like lightning mixed with fire, and he fell back again. "Not yet," the sword growled. But there was something new, a note of respect, faint but present. Kale smiled even though he was exhausted. This was only the beginning. He had found the sword, but the journey to worthiness had just begun. Over the next several days, Kale trained himself in ways he had never imagined. He practiced patience, thinking through every movement. He studied the markings on the sword, trying to understand its history and its power. He learned to control his fear, to act without hesitation, and to think beyond himself. Sometimes at night, the sword whispered stories of past warriors who had failed. At first, Kale found it discouraging, but slowly he realized the sword was teaching him, showing him what he needed to become. Each story carried a lesson, each vision a challenge, and Kale embraced it all, determined not to fail as others had. One evening, as the twin suns set, Kale approached the sword again. He reached out slowly, feeling the familiar pulse of energy. The sword's voice growled softly, a warning, but this time there was no harshness, only anticipation. Kale gripped the hilt firmly, his heart steady, his mind clear. He felt a spark of connection, a hint that he might be on the path the sword had been waiting for 1,000 years to find. The desert around him was silent, save for the whisper of the wind. Kale looked down at the sword and spoke aloud. "I will learn from you. I will grow. I will be worthy." For the first time, the sword's glow was steady, a gentle hum resonating through Kale's body. It did not fully approve yet, but it acknowledged him. And in that moment, Kale understood something important. Worthiness was not a gift. It was earned, and he had just taken the first step toward earning it. As night fully settled over Arden, Kale camped near the crater, the sword glowing faintly beside him. He was exhausted, sore, and unsure of what the coming days would bring. But he was ready. Whatever challenges awaited, he would face them. He would grow, and maybe, just maybe, the sword would finally say the words every warrior hoped to hear. "You are ready." The journey of 1,000 years had begun again, and this time Kale was determined to finish it. The morning sun painted Arden's jagged cliffs in pale gold as Kale stood once again before the sword. Its glow was faint but steady, pulsing like the heartbeat of the planet itself. The voice inside his mind, deep and commanding, stirred him awake like a drumbeat. "You return?" it said, low and cautious. "Do you think courage alone will make you worthy?" Kyle clenched his fists. "I know I'm not ready yet," he admitted. "But I want to learn. I want to understand what you need." The sword hummed, a sound both musical and commanding. Slowly, the glow along its blade expanded, and Kale felt a rush of energy that was not painful this time, but enlightening. The sword began to show him visions. First, he saw a warrior standing on a battlefield, shining armor scorched, face bruised. The warrior lifted the same sword Kale now sought, but his hands trembled. He struck with all his strength, yet fell. The vision shifted. Kale could see the fear in the warrior's eyes, the hesitation that had cost him victory. This warrior lacked certainty, the sword murmured. He acted with strength, but without understanding. He believed might alone could win. He failed. Kale nodded, watching carefully. He had thought courage was enough. He had been wrong. True strength, the sword seemed to teach, required wisdom. Next, the visions changed to a woman standing in the midst of chaos. Civilians ran past her as enemies advanced. She could have fought, could have taken the sword and gained power, but instead she helped the frightened people escape. She was strong, brave, and wise, but she lacked patience. In her rush, she was ambushed, and the sword fell from her hands. Kale flinched at the sight. So it's not just courage, not just compassion. It's everything combined, he whispered. You want someone complete? The sword pulsed in response. Correct. You must learn from those who failed before. Understand their mistakes. Let them guide you. Only then can you rise. Kyle spent days studying the visions, practicing movements, and meditating on the lessons the sword revealed. He climbed Arden's cliffs, tested his balance on narrow ledges, and practiced strikes without touching the sword. Each day he grew stronger, not just in body but in mind. He learned patience, focus, and control. Slowly, the voice inside him became calmer. Slowly, the sword allowed him to feel its energy without pain. But Arden was not as empty as it seemed. While Kale trained, a shadow moved across the horizon. A fleet of sleek, black ships descended from the sky, landing on the cliffs with mechanical precision. The Zitherians had arrived. Kale crouched behind a rock, his heart racing. He had heard of the Zitherians, ruthless, cunning, and determined to take anything that could grant power. And the sword was exactly what they wanted. From a distance, he saw their leader, a tall figure in dark armor surveying the landscape. Kale realized immediately that brute force would not save him. He could not fight the Zitherians with his current skill. He had to outthink them. But even as fear gripped him, Kale felt a surge of determination. The sword was nearby, and if it had chosen him for these trials, he would not fail. The Zitherians advanced, scanning the area. Kale used the rocky terrain to hide, moving silently like a shadow. He noticed the leader gesturing toward the pedestal. "The sword must be ours," the leader said in a cold, mechanical voice. "Do not allow it to resist. Seize it by force if necessary." Kale's mind raced. Force alone could not defeat them, but strategy could. He thought of the lessons the sword had shown him. Patience, observation, and understanding. He studied the enemy's movements, their patterns, and weaknesses. As the Zitherians reached the pedestal, Kale stepped out of hiding, calling to them. "Wait," he shouted. They turned, surprised by the small human standing before them. "You don't understand the sword. It cannot be taken by force." The leader's voice echoed coldly. "Then step aside, human, or be removed." Kale's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "It will judge who is worthy. Only those who prove themselves through courage, wisdom, and compassion can wield it." The Zitherians hesitated, unused to negotiation. Kale seized the moment. He moved quickly, setting traps among the rocks. Loose stones, angled ridges, and debris designed to slow them down. As the Zitherians advanced, they stumbled, triggering Kyle's small but clever obstacles. One of them fell, others hesitated, and in that moment, Kyle dashed toward the sword. He grasped the hilt just barely and felt a surge of energy. The sword pulsed violently, almost angry, but Kale held on, focusing on controlling the power rather than using it to strike. He felt the history of the sword, the centuries of waiting, the warriors who had failed, and he channeled that knowledge into steadiness. The Zitherians recovered quickly and lunged forward. Kale knew he could not overpower them physically, but he could use his mind. He dodged, redirected, and manipulated their movements, leading them into the traps he had set. Rocks shifted, shadows concealed him, and clever maneuvers turned the enemy's strength into weakness. During the skirmish, Kyle noticed a small Zitherian child trapped under a fallen piece of metal. Without hesitation, he rushed to help, lifting the debris despite the enemy presence. The child looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. Kale offered a reassuring smile. "It's okay. You're safe now." The sword pulsed softly, almost approvingly. Kyle felt its energy shift, less judgmental, more curious. He realized something crucial. Worthiness was not just about defeating enemies. It was about protecting the innocent, even when doing so put him at risk. Once the child was safe, Kale retreated behind a ridge. The Gatherian leader growled in frustration. "The sword resists us. How can this human control it?" Kale took a deep breath, feeling the sword's presence through his hands. "It doesn't belong to the strongest," he whispered. "It belongs to the one who understands its purpose." For the first time, the sword allowed him to lift it fully. The energy surged through him not as pain, but as a connection, a bond. He could feel the history of the blade, the failures and lessons of past warriors. He understood that it sought not a conqueror, but a guardian, a true warrior in every sense of the word. The Zitherians, recognizing they could not seize the sword without understanding it, retreated for now. Kyle stood in the crater, breathing heavily, the sword glowing steadily in his hands. It had not fully accepted him yet, but it was testing him, and he had passed the first trial. Kale spent the night reflecting on what had happened. He had faced real enemies, protected the innocent, and resisted the temptation to use the sword for mere power. He realized that the lessons from the sword's visions were coming to life. He was not just training in isolation anymore. He was learning through experience. The sword's voice, usually stern, whispered softly as Cale slept. "You are learning. You are growing. But much remains ahead. Strength, courage, wisdom, compassion, all must be perfected before the bond is complete." Cale smiled despite exhaustion. This was what he had wanted, a challenge, a path to greatness, a chance to prove himself. He understood now that the sword was not just a weapon, it was a teacher, a guide, and a test of humanity itself. As he drifted into sleep under the stars, Kyle felt a quiet excitement. The Xitherians would return, no doubt, stronger and smarter. And he would be ready. He would face them again, but not with raw strength alone. He would face them with his mind, his heart, and the lessons the sword had shown him. Tomorrow, he thought, would be another day of learning, another trial, and he would rise to it, not as the clumsy, overlooked human who had first touched the sword, but as someone who was beginning to understand what it truly meant to be worthy. The sword hummed gently beside him, a soft pulse of anticipation. It had waited 1,000 years for a true warrior, and perhaps, Cale thought with a quiet smile, that warrior was beginning to awaken. Cale awoke to the sound of the wind whispering through the jagged rocks of Arden. The stars were fading as the twin suns rose, casting long shadows across the crater where the sword waited. He sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the past days pressing on him. Training, visions, and the skirmish with the Xitherians had taught him much. Yet he knew that the true test was still ahead. The sword rested on its pedestal, glowing faintly, its energy pulsing gently as if sensing Cale's thoughts. The voice within it spoke softly this time. "You grow, human, but growth alone is not enough. Strength, wisdom, and compassion must meet courage in perfect balance." Cale nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll keep learning. I'll keep trying. I won't fail." For hours, Cale practiced. He climbed rocky cliffs, balanced on narrow ledges, and ran through the desert terrain, pushing his body to the limits. But it was not physical strength alone that he trained. He meditated, focusing on patience and clarity. He studied the sword's markings, attempting to understand the patterns and the history etched into its blade. As he trained, Kyle felt the distant hum of movement, shadows on the horizon. He froze. The Xitherians were returning. He could see them now, their dark ships glinting in the rising sun, cutting across the desert in precise formation. The leader of the faction was at the forefront, scanning for the sword. Cale's heart raced, but he refused to panic. He had learned from the last encounter that brute force alone could not win this battle. He needed strategy, cleverness, and calm. He quickly surveyed the area, noting high ridges, narrow passes, and boulders that could serve as cover or traps. The desert, once empty and desolate, now became his ally. The Xitherians landed closer to the pedestal, moving with silent precision. Cale could see their leader signaling toward the sword. "It belongs to us," the leader said, voice cold and metallic. "Do not let the human interfere." Cale gritted his teeth. "It doesn't belong to anyone yet," he muttered. "Not until it chooses a true warrior." He crept through the rocks, keeping low and silent, observing the enemy's formation. Their soldiers were skilled, but Cale noticed patterns in their movements. They were strong but predictable. That gave him an advantage. The sword pulsed gently as if sensing his intentions. "Caution, human," it said. "The test is not only strength and speed. Protect the innocent. Outthink your enemy." Cale's eyes darted to the side. A small group of Xitherian soldiers had begun searching the perimeter. He needed to act quickly. Using rocks, sand, and debris, he set traps designed to slow them down, not hurt them. Rolling boulders, loose stones, and jagged ridges forced the soldiers to stumble, giving Cale the upper hand. Then, he noticed a Xitherian child trapped under a fallen metal frame, frightened and crying. Cale froze. He knew that helping the child could put him in danger, but he also remembered the sword's lesson. True worthiness required compassion even when it was risky. Without hesitation, Cale sprinted toward the child. The metal frame was heavy, but he lifted it with all his strength. The child looked up at him with wide eyes. "It's okay," Cale said, his voice steady despite the tension. "You're safe now." The sword pulsed sharply, a bright glow traveling up its blade. "You understand?" it whispered. Cale felt the connection between him and the sword strengthen. But it was still not complete. The Zytherians were advancing and the final challenge was still ahead. Kale ran back to the pedestal, holding the sword in both hands. The energy surged through him, testing his grip, testing his resolve. This was more than a weapon. It was a test of his mind, his courage, and his heart. The Zytherians had reached him, and the battle was about to begin. He dodged their attacks, using the terrain to his advantage. Rocks shifted, creating barriers. Shadows concealed his movements. Each step was deliberate, each action calculated. He could feel the sword responding to his decisions, guiding him subtly, teaching him in real time. During the fight, Kale realized that raw strength would not save him. He needed to think beyond himself, predict the enemy's actions, and act with clarity. He feigned weakness in one area, luring the soldiers into traps, then moved quickly to outmaneuver them. Every time he acted wisely, the sword pulsed, approving his choices. The Zytherian leader, observing the battle, frowned. "How does this human control the sword?" he demanded. "It should obey only strength, yet he moves with more than strength." Kale understood that the sword was responding not to power, but to his understanding. He focused on calm, clear thinking, on protecting the innocent, and on making choices that reflected wisdom and compassion. It was exhausting, but every movement brought him closer to the bond he sought. Finally, the leader decided to act personally. He lunged toward the pedestal, but Kale anticipated it. Using the sword, he deflected the attack without striking a lethal blow. The sword's energy flowed through him, not as destructive force, but as controlled power, a channel for his intent, rather than a weapon of mere violence. The Zytherians faltered. Their confusion gave Kale the advantage. He used quick thinking, clever maneuvers, and the knowledge he had gained from the sword's lessons to outmaneuver them. Slowly, the soldiers retreated, recognizing that brute force could not overcome the human who wielded the sword with understanding. When the last of the Zytherians fled, Kale stood alone in the crater, breathing heavily. The sword glowed steadily now, its energy calm and resonant. "You have grown," it said, its voice soft and approving. "You are learning to combine strength, wisdom, courage, and compassion. But the trials are not over. Greater challenges lie ahead." Kale nodded, feeling a sense of pride and humility at the same time. He knew this victory was not just about fighting enemies. It was about proving to himself and to the sword that he could act rightly under pressure, that he could protect the innocent, and that he could think beyond his own desires. Over the next few days, Kale continued his training. The sword allowed him to lift it fully for short periods, testing his control and patience. Each day he felt more connected to it. He practiced not only combat techniques, but also strategy, meditation, and observation. He learned to anticipate challenges, not react to them. He studied the stars, the terrain, and the patterns of life on Arden. At night, the sword shared visions of past warriors once again, but this time, Kale approached them differently. He studied their successes as well as their failures. He understood their mistakes and learned from them. He began to see that the sword's power was not meant to be wielded recklessly. It was a test, a guide, and a teacher. One evening, as the twin suns set, Kale stood on a high ridge overlooking the crater. He could see the distant Zytherian ships retreating, but he knew they would return. The sword hummed softly, its energy steady and strong. Kale felt a quiet connection, a whisper of approval that told him he was moving in the right direction. He spoke aloud, more to himself than to anyone else. "I'm ready for what comes next. I will not fail. I will learn, and I will grow. I will become worthy of you." The sword's glow brightened as if responding to his determination. Kale could feel its energy resonating with his own, a bond forming slowly, testing his resolve and his heart. He knew that the challenges ahead would be greater, that enemies would return stronger and smarter. But he also knew that he was no longer the same human who had first touched the sword. He had begun to grow into something more. As night fell over Arden, Kale camped near the sword, the desert quiet except for the wind and the faint hum of the weapon. He closed his eyes, feeling the energy pulse gently through the ground, through the sword and through him. He dreamed not of victory or fame, but of understanding, of learning, of becoming the warrior the sword had waited 1,000 years to find. And somewhere deep within the sword, a soft thought lingered. The journey was far from over, but perhaps for the first time, the human before it had begun to awaken to his true potential. Kale awoke to a world changed. The sun rose over the jagged cliffs of Arden, but the tranquility of the morning was deceptive. Smoke rose in the distance. The Scytherians had returned, larger in number, more determined, and with an arsenal of weapons that glinted under the twin suns. Cale felt the sword pulse beside him, alive and aware. Its energy was stronger than ever, resonating with his heartbeat. He had trained, studied, and grown, but the ultimate test had come. The Scytherians sought to claim the sword, believing that its power alone could give them dominion over the stars. Cale understood now that defeating them would require more than skill. It would require the full measure of what the sword had taught him. He studied the battlefield from his vantage point. The Scytherians' formation was tight and methodical. They expected him to strike with force, to attack recklessly, but Cale had learned to think beyond strength. He planned a strategy that used every advantage the desert offered. Rocks, shadows, ridges, and narrow paths became his allies. He moved silently, setting traps that would slow and confuse the enemy. The leader of the Scytherians spotted him and sneered. "The human believes he can control the sword, pathetic." Cale ignored the taunt. He focused, feeling the sword's energy flow into him. The bond was deeper now, almost complete. He could sense its approval, though faint, and it encouraged him to act with clarity, courage, and compassion. The battle began. Cale moved swiftly, using his traps to disrupt the enemy formation. He avoided unnecessary conflict, striking only to protect himself or others. The Scytherians, frustrated by his tactics, struggled to predict his movements. Then he noticed a group of civilians caught in the crossfire, a mix of colonists and alien traders who had arrived on Arden to study the planet. Without hesitation, Cale rushed to shield them, placing himself between the civilians and the advancing soldiers. The sword hummed, its energy guiding his movements. He deflected attacks, creating a path for the innocents to escape, using strategy rather than brute force. The Scytherian leader, angered by Cale's skill, advanced personally. Cale felt the sword vibrate in his hands as if warning him. The fight was intense. Each strike from the leader was met with precise blocks and counters, Cale moving with calm calculation. He was no longer just fighting to survive. He was embodying everything the sword demanded: strength, wisdom, courage, and compassion. During the battle, Cale saw an opportunity. The Scytherians were organized, but they relied on their machines and formations. He used their overconfidence against them, leading them into narrow passages where their numbers became a disadvantage. The sword guided his movements, lending him power without overwhelming him. Every decision Cale made was measured, every strike deliberate. Finally, the leader lunged in a final, desperate attack. Cale met the strike with the sword fully in hand. The energy surged through him, not as pain, but as perfect harmony. He felt the connection with the sword complete in that moment. The Scytherian leader faltered, recognizing that strength alone could not win. Cale disarmed him without striking a lethal blow, showing mercy, and in doing so, he proved to the sword and himself that true power is measured not by destruction, but by wisdom and restraint. The remaining Scytherians retreated, defeated not by violence alone, but by a combination of strategy, compassion, and courage. Cale stood amidst the crater, breathing heavily, the sword glowing steadily in his hands. It had finally acknowledged him, its growl now a low hum of approval. "You have grown, human," the sword said, its voice calm and deep. "You have proven yourself worthy, not by might alone, but by heart and mind. You are ready." Cale smiled, exhaustion and pride mingling in his chest.
He had not just survived.
He had risen to become the warrior the sword had waited 1,000 years to find. As the twin suns set, Cale held the sword high. Its energy resonated with the planet itself, a symbol of hope, courage, and the potential of humanity. The Scytherians, now understanding that the sword chose not just a wielder, but a guardian, vowed peace for now. Cale returned to his camp that night, the sword by his side, reflecting on everything he had learned. Worthiness, he realized, was a combination of strength, wisdom, courage, and compassion. Each quality alone was insufficient. Only together could a true warrior emerge. He whispered to the sword, "I will protect you. I will learn from you. I will honor you." The sword's glow pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat, and Cale understood that their journey together was only beginning. Cale awoke to a quiet morning, the desert calm and still. The Scytherians had retreated, leaving Arden in relative peace, but Cale knew that news of the sword, and his deeds, would spread quickly across the stars. The power he now wielded was extraordinary, but he also understood its responsibility. The sword hummed softly beside him, its energy calm, steady, and alive. Cale lifted it, feeling the pulse of history and wisdom flowing through him. He could sense the countless warriors who had tried and failed before, their stories etched into the blade. Now it was his task to honor them and the lessons they left behind. Cale returned to his colony on Proxima 9, not as the timid, inexperienced human who had first discovered the sword, but as a leader and guardian. Word of his courage, strategy, and compassion spread quickly. Humans and aliens alike were inspired not by the power of the sword alone, but by the actions of the human who had earned its trust. He established a training academy for humans and aliens, teaching them not only combat and strategy but the values that the sword had demanded: wisdom, courage, and compassion. Students practiced together, learning to respect one another and to think beyond mere strength. Cale shared the lessons of Arden, emphasizing that true heroism was measured not by victory alone, but by the choices one made in moments of challenge. The sword became a symbol of hope and humanity's potential. Cale carried it not as a weapon but as a teacher and guide. It whispered stories of past warriors to him, reminding him of what had been learned and what could still be achieved. He grew into a leader who inspired through example, showing that even the smallest, overlooked human could rise to greatness with courage and wisdom. The Zetherians honored the truce. Inspired by Cale's leadership and integrity, they began to see that power without understanding was dangerous, and they respected the human who had wielded the sword with patience and compassion. Years passed. Cale trained a new generation of warriors, explorers, and leaders. The sword remained with him, a steady presence and guide. Together they traveled to distant planets, resolving conflicts, protecting the innocent, and inspiring hope wherever they went. At night, Cale would sit by the sword, reflecting on his journey. "You waited 1,000 years for a true warrior," he said softly, "and now you have one. But our work is never done. There are always lessons to learn and always more to protect." The sword pulsed gently in response, its glow warm and steady. Cale smiled, feeling a sense of peace and purpose. Humanity had risen to meet the challenge. He had risen, and the sword, which had once growled at him in disapproval, now rested in the hands of someone who understood its true meaning. In the quiet desert of Arden, under the light of distant stars, Cale knew one thing clearly: true heroism was not about power, fame, or conquest. It was about courage, wisdom, compassion, and the choice to act rightly, even when it was difficult. And with the sword at his side, he would continue to embody those values, ensuring that its legacy, and the legacy of humanity, would endure for generations to come. The sword, silent now except for its gentle hum, had finally found its true warrior, and Cale had found his purpose.